The blizzard erased the world beyond the windshield, turning my startup's final road trip into a whiteout death trap. The rental car had died 2 miles back, my phone died with it, and the $47 in my pocket felt useless against the encroaching freeze. Then the ranch appeared like a mirage, a single amber light in the void, the only structure for miles. My knuckles were raw from knocking, the cold numbing my desperation. When the door finally opened, heat and wood smoke spilled out, instantaneous and overwhelming. I forgot my pitch deck. I forgot the quarterly reports. I only knew survival, and the woman standing there looked like the only decision that mattered. She didn't speak immediately. Her dark eyes scanned me with a precision that felt professional, dissecting the soaked blazer, the useless designer boots, and the violent shivering that I couldn't suppress. She wasn't just looking at a stranger. She was assessing a liability. I tried to straighten my spine, a reflex from too many boardroom interrogations, but the cold had stripped away my armor. "I just need shelter," I managed, my teeth chattering hard enough to bite the words in half. "Is there room in the loft? I can pay what I have, just until the storm passes." The silence stretched. The wind howled around the eaves, a sharp, stark contrast to the stillness of her posture. She leaned against the doorframe, one hand resting high on the wood, blocking the warmth from fully escaping, or perhaps blocking me from entering too presumptuously. She was calculating risk versus mercy in a place where mercy could be dangerous. "Loft's full of hay," she said finally, her voice low and rough, like gravel under tires. "And no heat. You'd freeze before morning." My heart sank deep into my frozen soles. I had expected a negotiation, a barter, maybe a refusal based on mistrust. I hadn't expected physics to be the deal breaker. I turned, ready to face the white void again because there was no other option. But her voice stopped me. "No, you're staying in my cabin." The words landed like a contract I hadn't read but had already signed. I turned back. She wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at me with a terrifying practicality. She grabbed a heavy coat from a peg near the door, shrugging into it with fluid, practiced movements. "It's 100 yards back," she said, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the main house door shut behind her. "Stay close." The walk was a blur of biting wind and knee-deep drifts. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs. I stumbled, my boots finding no purchase on the ice beneath the snow. A strong hand gripped my elbow, steadying me. The touch was electric and necessary, a sudden anchor in the chaos. She didn't let go. She guided me through the blindness of the storm with an assurance that made me want to lean my entire weight against her. We reached a smaller structure, dark against the snow. She kicked the door open and ushered me inside. The silence here was different, heavier, closer. She struck a match, the flare illuminating a single room that smelled of cedar and old wool. "Stove still warm," she muttered, moving to a cast-iron wood stove in the center of the room. She fetted a log, the fire crackling to life, casting dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls. I stood by the door, dripping and uncertain. The cabin was an exercise in minimalism. One room, a bed in the corner, neatly made with heavy quilts, a small table, one chair, a kitchenette that consisted of a basin and a hot plate. It was the intimacy of pure function. There was nowhere to hide here. "You're Iris?" she asked, not looking up from the fire. I hadn't told her my name. I realized I must have said it at the door, or maybe she just knew things. "Yes," I whispered. "I'm Sage," she said, standing up and dusting ash from her hands. She turned to face me, the firelight catching the sharp angle of her jaw. The space between us felt suddenly very small. "Get those wet clothes off. I'll find you something dry." She moved past me to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. I watched her, the way she moved with economy and strength. In my world, power was posturing and volume. Here, power was heat and shelter, and the ability to keep the storm at bay. I realized then that my $47 and my title meant absolutely nothing. I was entirely at her mercy. And as she turned back with a flannel shirt in her hands, her gaze unflinching, I realized I didn't mind at all. "Here," she said, tossing the flannel shirt. It landed on the quilt. I'll turn around. My wet blouse peeled away like a second skin. The freezing air bit my shoulders before I dove into the flannel. It engulfed me. It smelled of cedar smoke, pine, and something darker. Her. It wasn't just a garment. It was a fortress. "You can turn back," I said, my voice small. Sage turned. Her dark eyes swept over me again. The shirt hung to my mid-thigh. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "Better," she said. Now began the awkward choreography of two strangers trapped in a box. The cabin was hardly 400 square feet. Every movement was a negotiation of territory. If she moved to the cupboard, I shifted toward the bed. If I stepped toward the fire, she had to lean back against the table. The air thickened, charged with the static of proximity. We orbited each other, distinct bodies forced into the same gravity well. She moved to the stove, the metal clinking as she set a percolator on the heat. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging my knees, watching her back. The muscles shifted under her thermal shirt as she worked. Her movements fascinated me. Precision, no wasted energy. "Coffee," she announced, turning with 2 tin mugs. She extended one. My hands were still trembling, a residual aftershock of the freeze. As I reached for the mug, my fingers brushed hers. Her skin was rough, calloused, and hot. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I gripped the mug, letting the heat bleed into my palms. It felt like a first round of funding, essential, life-sustaining. "Thank you," I murmured. She leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee, watching me over the rim. The silence wasn't empty. She was reading me like a contract, looking for the fine print. "You're not dressed for a blizzard, Iris," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "And you're definitely not from around here." "San Francisco," I admitted. I run a tech startup. Or I did, before the car died." She nodded slowly. "I know the look. High stakes, low sleep, running on caffeine and ambition." "You sound like you've been there," I said. Sage set her mug down. "Corporate law, Chicago. 10 years of mergers and acquisitions before I bought this place." The confession hung in the air. I stared at her. This rugged ranch hand was a refugee from my own world. It cut too close. She'd escaped the very thing that was currently crushing me. "Why did you leave?" I asked. "Same reason you're shivering," she said cryptically. "The cold gets into your bones eventually." She moved to prepare food. Canned stew. She opened it with a knife, the metal scraping metal, a harsh sound in the quiet. We ate at the small table, knees almost touching. It was simple fare, but the way she watched me eat, her gaze steady, unblinking, made it feel like a 5-course negotiation dinner, where the stakes were my own vulnerability. "You eat like you haven't seen food in 2 days, she noted. "I haven't," I said. "Cash flow problems." She didn't offer pity. She just pushed a piece of bread toward me. "Eat." Outside, the wind screamed, a reminder of the hostile world we were locking out. Inside, the fire popped. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards. Darkness had fallen completely now, turning the windows into black mirrors. The cabin felt even smaller. And then the furniture in the corner. The bed. There was only one. It was narrow, covered in a heavy patchwork quilt. I looked at it, then at the hard wooden floor, then at Sage. She was watching me track the logistics. The tension in the room spiked, heavy with implication. We were 2 women, strangers, alone in a blizzard, with 1 mattress between us. "I can sleep on the floor," I offered, though the thought made my bones ache. Sage laughed, a low, dry sound. "You're already hypothermic, Iris. You take the bed." "And you?" "It's a big enough bed," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "If we stay on our own sides." She held my gaze, unflinching. The challenge was there, buried in the offer. It wasn't predatory, just practical, yet laden with a heat that rivaled the wood stove. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." I woke to the sound of iron rasping against iron. The bed beside me was empty, the sheets cool to the touch, retaining only a ghost of the warmth we had shared in the night. I sat up, pulling the heavy quilt around my shoulders. Sage was already at the stove, her back to me, stoking the fire with a rhythmic, practiced efficiency. The morning light filtering through the frosted window was gray and weak, but it caught the sharp line of her profile as she turned. She looked like part of the cabin's architecture, solid, structural, and entirely unbothered by the blizzard that was still trying to bury us alive. "Coffee's almost ready," she said, not looking at me, but I felt the comment land like a directive. I swung my legs out of bed. The floorboards were freezing, a shock that traveled straight up my spine. I grabbed the flannel shirt I'd discarded in the night, wrapping it tight. I moved to the kitchenette, watching her handle the old percolator. In my world, coffee came from a machine that cost more than a used car and required an app to operate. Here, it was alchemy. "I don't know how to use that," I admitted, nodding at the battered metal pot. Sage stepped closer. The space in the kitchenette evaporated. "It's about listening, not timing," she said. She took my hand, her fingers rough and warm, and placed it on the handle. "Feel the vibration? When it settles, it's done." Her hand covered mine completely. The heat of her skin seeped into my knuckles. It was a deliberate, instructional touch, yet the air between us charged instantly. I wasn't just learning about coffee. I was learning the weight of her palm. She held the contact a second longer than necessary before pulling away. "Drink up," she said, her voice dropping. "We have work to do." The work involved trekking through waist-deep drifts to the barn. The wind had sharpened overnight, turning the snow into flying glass. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of molasses, dry hay, and animal heat. It was a sensory assault, earthy and real. "Grab that bucket," Sage ordered, pointing to a grain bin. I fumbled with the heavy scoop, my movements jerky and unsure. The grain spilled. I was a CEO who could navigate a hostile board takeover, but I couldn't feed a horse without making a mess. I felt a flush of embarrassment heat my neck. "Easy," Sage murmured. She moved behind me. Her chest brushed my back, a wall of solid heat against my shivering frame. She reached around, her hands covering mine on the scoop handle. "It's about leverage, not force. Tilt your wrist." She guided the motion. We moved in unison, a single entity pouring grain. The horse nickered, dipping its head. Sage didn't step back immediately. For a heartbeat, I was bracketed by her arms, held in the circle of her competence. The intimacy of the task was undeniable. She was rewriting my muscle memory. "We need to check the paddock fence," she said, finally stepping away. The loss of her warmth was a physical blow. If the wind took a post down, the drifts will bury it by noon. We worked side by side in the whiteout. My hands, usually reserved for typing and handshakes, were clumsy in borrowed leather gloves. I held the hammer, she held the spikes. The rhythm of the work opened something in me. The isolation here wasn't a trap anymore. It was a sanctuary. There were no emails, no investors, just the wind and the wood. "So," Sage said, shouting over the gale as she braced a post, "you said you ran a startup. Past tense." "It crashed," I yelled back, driving a nail in with more force than necessary. "Spectacularly." "Market shift?" "Embezzlement," I said, the word tasting like ash. "My CFO. He didn't just cook the books, he burned the library. I lost everything trying to cover the employee's severance." Sage stopped working. She looked at me, snow catching in her dark lashes. "You took the hit for them?" "I was the CEO. The buck stops with me." She nodded slowly, a gesture of respect that felt heavier than any industry award I'd ever received. "That's not a failure of strategy, Iris. That's a failure of trust. You can't hedge against a partner who's drilling holes in the hull." We finished in silence, the physical exertion burning the frustration out of my muscles. By the time we stumbled back into the cabin, shaking snow from our coats, the dynamic had shifted. We weren't strangers anymore. We were a team that had survived the elements. That evening, Sage poured 2 fingers of whiskey into the tin mugs. The fire roared, pushing back the shadows. We sat at the small table, the amber liquid catching the light. "To bad investments," she toasted, clinking her mug against mine. "To cutting losses," I replied. She watched me over the rim of her cup, her eyes dark and unreadable. She wasn't judging the ruin of my life. She was assessing the salvage value. And for the first time in months, I felt like I might actually be worth saving. The whiskey hit my stomach like a flare, illuminating the wreckage I'd been trying to navigate in the dark for weeks. The warmth of the alcohol, combined with the hypnotic dance of the flames in the stove, dismantled the last of my corporate defenses. I hadn't intended to spill the details. the humiliating, granular specifics of my failure. But Sage's silence was a vacuum that pulled the truth out of me. It wasn't just a bad quarter, I said, staring into the amber liquid in my tin cup. Marcus was my co-founder. We built the code in my garage. When the forensic accountant called me, I thought it was a mistake. But the numbers didn't lie. He'd been siphoning capital into shell companies for 18 months. I looked up. Sage was watching me, her face unreadable in the shifting light. She didn't offer the usual platitudes about resilience or pivot strategies. She just listened, her stillness an anchor. The lead investor pulled the term sheet the next morning, I continued, my voice cracking. I liquidated my savings to pay the staff their final checks. I sold the apartment. I got in the car and just drove west until the road ran out. I wasn't looking for a ranch. I was looking for a place where no one knew my name or my credit score. Sage took a slow sip of her whiskey. So you're not just broke, Iris. You're hollowed out. Bankrupt, I corrected. In every sense. I know the feeling, she said softly. But money you can earn back. Time is the only asset you can't restructure. She set her cup down. The sound was sharp against the wood. I didn't leave Chicago because of the billable hours. I was on the partner track. I thrived on the pressure. I left because the city became a graveyard. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The air thickened, heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with balance sheets. Her name was Elena, Sage said. It was the first time I'd heard her voice soften, the edges of her command blurring into something raw. We were together for 4 years. She was an architect. She saw the world in lines and light. We had plans, a loft in the West Loop, a life. She looked at the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames, but seeing something much colder. It was a Tuesday, raining. A truck ran a red light on Lakeshore Drive. I was in a deposition. I didn't check my phone until noon. By then, she was already gone. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just a story, it was an excavation. We sat there, 2 women stripped of our armor by the storm, revealing the wounds that had driven us into isolation. My betrayal was a sharp, stinging cut. Her loss was a structural collapse. I couldn't stay, she whispered. Every street corner looked like her. Every deposition felt meaningless. I bought this land because it was empty. I thought if I surrounded myself with enough silence, the noise in my head would stop. I reached across the small table. I didn't think about it. The gesture was instinctual. My hand found hers, my fingers brushing against the rough, callous skin of her knuckles. It wasn't a gesture of pity. Pity is vertical, looking down. This was horizontal. This was equity. Sage didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, catching my fingers. Her thumb traced the line of my knuckles, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a current straight up my arm. It was a question and an answer in one motion. The contact was electric, grounding me in the present moment, pulling me out of the wreckage of my past and into the heat of the room. We're quite a pair, she murmured, her eyes locking onto mine. The bankrupt CEO and the runaway lawyer. We're surviving, I said, my voice barely a whisper. For now, she agreed. The fire popped, a log settling into the embers. The mood shifted from confession to awareness. The space between us, once filled with words, was now filled with the undeniable hum of proximity. It's late, she said, withdrawing her hand slowly, leaving my skin tingling with the ghost of her touch. The fire needs banking. We moved around the small cabin in a new kind of rhythm. The awkwardness of the first night had dissolved, replaced by a heavy, conscious tension. When it came time for the bed, the question hung there again, unresolved and heavy. Floor's still cold, Sage said, not looking at me as she straightened the quilt. I'm not sleeping on the floor, I said, finding a sudden, surprising courage. Good, she said. We climbed in. The mattress dipped, pulling us toward the center. We lay on our backs, staring at the shadowed ceiling. There were inches between us, a demilitarized zone of flannel and cotton. But I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a steady, solid warmth that seeped into my side. Good night, Iris, she said in the dark. Good night, Sage. I didn't sleep for a long time. I lay there, listening to her breathing, steady into a rhythm, acutely aware that the storm outside was nothing compared to the shift happening inside these 4 walls. We were 2 broken things, drifting in the whiteout, and for the first time, we had found a coordinate. The proximity wasn't just necessary for survival anymore. It was becoming a new currency, one I was desperate to accumulate. I woke to the weight of a decision. It was heavy, solid, and resting directly across my waist. Sage's arm was draped over me, her hand relaxed against the flannel covering my stomach. In the gray, filtered light of dawn, the cabin was freezing. I could see my own breath pluming in the air. But the heat radiating from her body against my back was a furnace. I lay there, paralyzed not by the cold, but by a sudden, fierce desire to remain exactly where I was, to absorb this stolen warmth, to let the boundaries of stranger and savior dissolve into the simple physics of skin and breath. When she finally stirred, pulling her arm back with a low, groggy groan of waking, the loss of contact felt like a breach of contract I hadn't realized we'd signed. "You're staring at that axe like it's a lawsuit," Sage observed 2 hours later. We were outside. The storm had paused, leaving a silence so deep it rang in my ears. The world buried under 3 feet of brilliant, blinding white. I stood by the woodpile, gripping the hickory handle of the splitting maul. "I'm visualizing the trajectory," I countered, adjusting my grip. "It's about finding the fault line." "It's wood, Iris, not a pivot strategy. Just swing." She thought I was soft. Just another suit who couldn't survive without a barista and a board of directors. I gritted my teeth, planting my boots in the snow. I raised the axe, channeling every ounce of frustration at the storm, at my CFO, at the cold, into the downswing. The blade bit deep, splitting the oak log with a satisfying, violent crack. Sage raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on her lips as she leaned against the porch rail. "Not bad for a CEO." "I did kickboxing in the marina," I said, breathless, the cold air burning my lungs. "I know how to throw a punch." "Kickboxing," she teased, stepping closer, her eyes dancing. "Cute." The challenge migrated inside with the firewood. We sat at the small table, the air thick with the scent of pine sap and the fresh coffee bubbling on the stove. "It's about leverage," she insisted, planting her elbow on the scarred wood. "Pure physics." "It's about will," I argued, clasping her hand. Her grip was rough, her palm calloused, a map of hard labor against my smooth, keyboard-soft skin. We pushed. Her strength was immovable, like the granite beneath the snow. But I held on. I stared into her eyes, dark and amused, and pushed back with everything I had left. The playful tension shifted. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then snapped back up. The air charged, heavy and sudden. My arm trembled, not from weakness, but from the proximity. She slammed my hand down, pinning my wrist to the table, but she didn't let go. Her thumb grazed my pulse point. It was racing. She felt it. I knew she felt it. "You're stubborn," she murmured, her face inches from mine. "I'm persistent." Later, the rabbit was a necessity, a lesson she insisted on. "If you eat, you should know where it comes from," she said. My hands shook, holding the knife. "Steady," she commanded. She moved behind me again, that familiar, overwhelming heat pressing against my back. Her hands covered mine, enveloping them completely. "Here, guide the blade. Don't force it." I couldn't focus on the task. All I could feel was the line of her body against mine, her breath on my neck, the absolute control she exerted over my movements. It was intimate in a way that felt dangerous. We were dealing with life and death, and yet the sensation was entirely about life. About the heat of her chest, the strength of her fingers guiding my clumsy ones. "Precision, Iris," she whispered, her voice vibrating against my spine. I turned my head. Her face was right there. So close I could count the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. She pulled back as if burned. The knife clattered to the table. The silence in the cabin was deafening. "We need to talk about this," she said, her voice rough. "About what?" "About the way you look at me. About the way I want to touch you." The honesty hit me harder than the cold. "We're stuck here, Sage. I'm not going anywhere." "That's the problem," she said, pacing the small floor. "You're vulnerable. You're dependent on me for heat, for food. I won't take advantage of that." "I'm not a victim," I said, standing up to meet her. "I'm a grown woman, and I'm making a choice." She stopped, looking at me with that unflinching gaze. "We can touch," she conceded, the words sounding like a surrender. "But there are lines. I won't cross them. Not while you have no way to leave." "And if I don't want the lines?" "Then we redraw them," she said, her voice dropping to a husky whisper. slowly, kissing, touching. But everything else waits until the snow clears, until you can walk out that door if you want to. I don't want to walk out, I said. We'll see, she replied. The truce we had negotiated, touching permitted, lines drawn, lasted exactly 3 hours. It wasn't desire that shattered the calm. It was urgency. Sage had gone out for the evening check, leaving me to bank the fire. She returned 5 minutes later, the door slamming open against the wind. She didn't brush the snow from her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark with a fear I hadn't seen even when the generator died. It's Shadow, she said, the words clipped. The mare, she's foaling. It's too early. Call the vet, I said, the executive reflex kicking in before I remembered where we were. Lines are down, roads are gone. It's just us. She looked at me then, not as a guest, but as a resource. I need hands, Iris. Can you handle blood? I handled the SEC audit of 2019, I said, grabbing my coat. Lead the way. The barn was a cavern of shadows and distressed sounds. The mare was down in the straw, her sides heaving, sweat darkening her coat despite the freezing temperature. The smell was metallic, iron, and fear. Sage moved instantly to the animal's flank, her voice dropping to a low, soothing murmur, but her hands were trembling as she checked the position. She's breached, Sage whispered, panic threading through her control. One leg is back. If I don't turn it, we lose them both. Tell me what to do, I commanded. I moved to the mare's head. I didn't know horses, but I knew panic management. I knelt in the straw, ignoring the ruin of my designer trousers. I placed my hands on the mare's neck, feeling the terrified pulse hammering beneath the skin. Keep her down, Sage ordered, stripping off her jacket, rolling her sleeves to the shoulder. Talk to her. Keep her focused on you, not on what I'm doing. For the next hour, time dissolved. It became a blur of physical exertion and primal focus. Sage was fighting physics at the other end, her muscles straining, sweat dripping from her brow. I was the anchor. I spoke to the mare in the same low, steady cadence I used to calm jittery investors, pouring every ounce of reassurance I possessed into the animal's ear. Push, Sage grunted, her teeth grit. Come on, girl, push. You've got this, I murmured to the horse, stroking the velvet nose, my own fear a cold knot in my stomach. Stay with us. The crisis peaked in a moment of terrifying silence, followed by a wet, rushing sound. Sage fell back, gasping, her arms slick. In the straw, a wet, dark bundle moved. A head lifted. A sneeze. He's breathing, Sage choked out. He's out. The foal shook its head, blinking against the harsh light of the lantern. I watched the mare turn, nuzzling the new life, the transition from agony to instinct instantaneous. The adrenaline that had been holding me upright suddenly vanished, leaving my knees weak. I slumped back against a stack of hay bales. Sage crawled over to me. She was covered in straw and fluids, her hair escaping its tie, her chest heaving. She looked wild and exhausted and incredibly beautiful. She didn't stop at a polite distance. She collapsed next to me, her shoulder hitting mine, hard. We did it, she breathed, turning her head to look at me. The relief in her eyes was raw, unguarded. We did, I whispered. She reached out, her hand finding the back of my neck, pulling me in. It wasn't a gentle embrace. It was a collision of survival. I buried my face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of sweat and cedar and life. We held on to each other in the semi-darkness, the sound of the foal trying to stand the only noise in the world. The embrace shifted. The relief turned into something sharper, heavier. I felt her heartbeat against my chest, syncing with mine. I don't want to go back, I said into her skin. The truth of it surprised me. When the plows come, I don't want the road. Sage pulled back just enough to look at me. Her hand stayed on my neck, her thumb tracing the line of my jaw. I don't want you to go. This place, it's been a fortress for 10 years, just walls to keep the world out. You walked in and turned it back into a home. I'm broke, Sage. I have nothing to offer this place but work. You just helped save a life, she said fiercely. You think I care about your portfolio? You stayed. You held the line. I'm staying, I promised. If you'll have me. I'll have you, she said. We walked back to the cabin in a silence that felt completely different from the one we had entered with. The storm was breaking overhead. clouds tearing apart to reveal a sliver of moon. We didn't run from the cold this time. We walked slowly, her hand firmly clasped in mine, her grip tight, possessive. The decision had been made. The contract was signed, not in ink, but in the sweat and straw of the barn. We weren't waiting for the thaw anymore. We were waiting for the door to close so we could finally begin. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing the cabin against the howling wind and the memory of the blood in the straw. The silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of the first night, nor the companionable quiet of the second. It was vibrating. We stood there for a heartbeat, shedding layers of wool and gore, the adrenaline from the barn slowly transmuting into a different kind of fuel. Sage turned to hang her heavy coat, her movements stiff with exhaustion. But when she turned back, her eyes found mine with a terrifying directness. There was no more assessment, no more calculation of risk versus liability. There was only hunger. I didn't wait for her to bridge the gap. I crossed the floorboards, the distance disappearing in 2 determined strides. Her hands came up, not to stop me, but to catch me. When her mouth found mine, it wasn't a question. It was a collision. It tasted of whiskey, fatigue, and the sheer, raw relief of being alive. Her fingers tangled in my hair, gripping tight, pulling me closer until the zippers of our jackets scraped together. I made a sound, something low and desperate that I didn't recognize as my own voice. A sound that belonged to the storm, not the boardroom. She pulled back, just an inch, her breathing ragged, her forehead resting against mine, as a hot, grounding weight. "Iris," she rasped, the name sounding like a warning. "The lines. Remember the lines." "The storm is breaking, Sage," I whispered, my hands mapping the sharp line of her jaw, the rough texture of her skin against my palms. "I'm not a captive anymore. I'm a volunteer." "You're still stranded," she countered, though her hands were wandering, tracing the curve of my spine through the flannel with a possessive heat. I can't take everything. Not yet. Not until you can drive away and choose to come back. I need to know this isn't just gratitude for a warm room." "Then take what you can," I challenged, leaning into her touch. "Take what I'm giving you." We moved to the bed, the quilt heavy and welcoming in the dim firelight. We didn't undress fully. The cabin was still biting cold, but layers were loosened, skin revealed to the warmth of the stove and the heat of our bodies. The agreement stood. No crossing the final threshold. But the territory we could explore was vast. It was a study in contrast that fascinated me. My hands, manicured and soft from years of typing and sterile handshakes, looked pale and fragile against the bronze, weather-beaten landscape of her skin. Her hands were rough, the calluses rasping against my ribs like fine grit sandpaper, a sensation that was abrasive and addictive. She touched me with a reverence that felt foreign. In my world, touch was transactional or hurried. Here, it was a study. She mapped my collarbone with her thumb, learning the architecture of my body with the same patience she used to mend fences. "You're so soft," she murmured, her voice thick with wonder, her lips grazing the pulse at my throat. "Everywhere." "And you're solid," I replied, arching into the friction of her touch. "You feel like the ground." We spent the night on the precipice. Hands exploring, mouths claiming, bodies pressing together, seeking friction and heat without release. It was a torture of the best kind, a deliberate, slow-burn build that wasn't about the end goal, but about the tension itself. Every kiss was a promise of what would come later, when the roads cleared. Every touch was a deposit into an account we were building together. Sleep came in shallow drifts, interrupted by the need to pull her closer, to confirm she was still there. When morning finally broke, it brought a light that was blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off 3 feet of fresh snow. I woke to the smell of coffee, stronger and richer than before. I rolled over. Sage was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on her boots. She wasn't wearing a shirt yet. I lay there, feigning sleep, just watching her. Her back was a roadmap of muscle and history, a scar on her shoulder blade, the definition of her lats as she reached for her flannel. It was an intimate, domestic view that felt entirely earned. The awkwardness of the previous mornings was gone, replaced by a heavy, contented silence. She sensed me watching. She always did. She turned, a slow smile spreading across her face. Not the guarded smirk of the first day, but something open and easy. "Coffee's ready," she said. And I think I hear a plow in the distance. The mention of the plow should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a pang of anxiety. The plow meant the world was coming back. It meant signal. It meant expectations. I sat up, letting the quilt pool around my waist. "Let them plow," I said, reaching for my mug on the bedside table. "We're not going anywhere today." "We?" she asked, catching the pronoun, her eyes softening. "We," I confirmed. She leaned in, pressing a kiss to my forehead. Chaste, tender, possessing. "Drink your coffee, Iris. We have a ranch to run." Breakfast was a strategy meeting, disguised as a domestic ritual. The scrambled eggs were simple, cooked in the cast iron skillet with a knob of butter. But the conversation, hovering over the steaming plates, was pure, high-level negotiation. The sun had finally broken through the storm front, turning the window into a blinding square of white light that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. It was the kind of harsh, revealing brightness that usually exposes cracks in the foundation. Instead, it illuminated the potential in the room. I had found a ledger on the mantel while Sage was outside checking the generator. It was a battered notebook, the spine cracking, filled with her handwriting. Sharp, angular strokes that detailed feed costs, vet bills, and the dwindling margins of a small-scale cattle operation. I pushed my empty plate aside and placed the notebook between us. "You're bleeding cash on logistics," I said, tapping the page open to November. "You're paying a premium for individual feed deliveries because you don't have the storage for bulk. It's inefficient." Sage paused, her coffee mug halfway to her mouth. A lesser woman might have been defensive about a stranger auditing her finances before noon. Sage just lowered the mug, her dark eyes narrowing with interest. The corporate lawyer in her recognized the tone. I wasn't criticizing. I was consulting. "I know," she admitted, leaning back in the creaky wooden chair. "I don't have the capital to build a silo, and I don't have the time to negotiate better rates with the supplier and billings. I just pay the invoice so they leave." "I can fix that," I said. The pitch came naturally, a reflex honed in 1,000 venture capital meetings. But this time, the stakes felt infinitely higher. "I can't pay you rent, Sage. My accounts are frozen, and my credit is radioactive. But I can restructure your supply chain. I can digitize these books so you're not running a ranch out of a spiral notebook. I can build a direct-to-consumer site for your beef so you're not losing 30% to the auction house." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Let me invest. Not with money, but with this. Let me be your COO." Sage watched me, the silence stretching comfortably between us. She wasn't looking at a broke woman in borrowed flannel. She was looking at a partner. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine, grounding the energy I was projecting. "I don't need a tenant, Iris," she said, her voice low and steady. "And I don't need an employee. But there's a guest house about 50 yards past the barn. It's been full of boxes for a decade. It has a wood stove, a good view of the valley, and enough space for a desk." She traced the line in my wrist with her thumb, a distraction that threatened to derail my business logic. "You can stay. Rebuild here. Make that your headquarters. We run this place together. You handle the strategy, I handle the land." "A merger," I whispered. "A partnership," she corrected. 50-50. The air in the cabin shifted, settling into a new shape. The frantic desperation of the storm was gone, replaced by the solid weight of a plan. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were building. Then a sound cut through the peace. A violent, mechanical buzzing. My phone. It was sitting on the windowsill where I'd left it, in a futile hope for a charge. The return of the sun had apparently brought the cell towers back to life. The screen lit up, vibrating against the wood like an intruder. Unknown caller. I stared at it. I knew who it was. It was the forensic accountant, or the lawyer, or a reporter looking for a quote on the collapse of my empire. It was the old world, reaching out with its claws to drag me back into the noise and the shame. The vibration seemed to shake the entire cabin. Sage didn't speak. She didn't tell me to answer it, and she didn't tell me to ignore it. She just took a sip of her coffee, watching me over the rim, giving me the space to choose my own timeline. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the screen. Then I looked out at the snow, pristine, unbroken, covering the wreckage of the road. I thought about the foal standing in the straw. I thought about the heat of Sage's skin against mine in the dark. I pressed the side button. The buzzing stopped. I powered the device down completely, watching the screen fade to black. "Everything okay?" Sage asked quietly. "Better than okay," I said, turning back to her. "I'm not taking calls. I'm in a meeting." Sage set her mug down, a slow smile breaking across her face. A genuine, unguarded look that made her look 10 years younger. Good, because I was afraid I'd never feel this again. "You didn't just fix the fence, Iris. You brought me back to life." The final morning arrived, not with the dread of departure, but with the quiet, vibrating certainty of a closing statement that had gone exactly as planned. The plow had come through at dawn, a roaring mechanical beast that carved a canyon through the whiteout, reconnecting the ranch to the highway, to the cell towers, and to the reality I had fled. The physical barrier was removed. The road to San Francisco, to the liquidators, to the depositions and the shame of a public failure, was wide open. But as we sat at the table, finishing the last of the coffee in the heavy silence of the cabin, neither of us moved toward the door. Sage's hand rested on my thigh under the table. It was a casual, possessive weight, the kind of touch that speaks of established territory rather than tentative exploration. It was electric, yes, but it was also grounding, a constant reminder that while the storm had thrown us together, the calm wasn't going to tear us apart. "You could make the noon flight out of Bozeman," she said, her voice neutral, though her thumb was tracing lazy, rhythmic circles against my denim, betraying the tension in her frame. "The roads are clear. You could be back in a boardroom by tomorrow morning." "I could," I admitted, staring at the steam rising from my cup. I looked at the black screen of my phone, then at the battered ledger open between us. I thought about the empty apartment in the city, the hollow validation of industry mixers, the exhausting performance of being a visionary when you're running on fumes. Then I looked at Sage, the way the morning light caught the gray at her temples, the steady, unflinching capability in her hands, the way she had opened this cabin and her life to a stranger. "But I have a lot of work to do here," I said, the decision settling in my chest like a stone foundation. "That supply chain isn't going to optimize itself. And I'm done with boardrooms. I'm done with the lawsuits and the apologies. I'm not going back to be the woman who failed. I'm staying to be the woman who builds." Sage squeezed my leg, a silent, fierce acknowledgement of the contract we were sealing. Her eyes were wet, just for a second, before she blinked it away. "Then let's get to work. But first, you need to know what you're managing. You can't run a ranch from a spreadsheet, Iris. You have to feel it." The lesson took place in the paddock. The air was crisp, sharp enough to scour the lungs, smelling of pine and thawing earth. She introduced me to a gelding named Buster, a creature of immense power and surprising gentleness. "It's not about dominance," Sage said, adjusting the stirrup while I sat in the saddle, feeling impossibly high off the ground. She stood close, her chest brushing my knee, her presence calming both me and the horse. "It's about communication. You have to ask, not demand. If you try to force him, he'll throw you. If you guide him, he'll take you anywhere." My startup adaptability kicked in. I realized this was just another interface, one that required core strength and subtle inputs rather than code. I straightened my spine, looked toward the horizon, and signaled with my heels. Sage walked beside us, her hand occasionally correcting my posture, her touch lingering on my calf, my thigh, correcting the angle of my boot with a firm, intimate pressure. "Heels down, eyes up," she commanded softly, looking up at me with a gaze that stripped away the last of my defenses. "Look where you want to go, not where you're afraid to fall." It was the best advice I'd received in 10 years of business. As we circled the paddock, I felt a shift. The fear of the fall vanished, replaced by the rhythm of the ride. I looked at Sage, walking in the center of the ring, watching me with pride and desire. She wasn't hiding anymore. The isolation she had cultivated for a decade was gone, replaced by this partnership. We weren't married, we hadn't signed papers, but as our eyes locked across the snowy distance, I knew this was a commitment deeper than any operating agreement I had ever drafted. We were choosing each other, not because the blizzard trapped us, but because we were finally, terrifyingly free. The cabin door stands open now, no longer a barrier against the storm, but an invitation to the life we're building together. The ranch isn't silent anymore. It's filled with the noise of return and the quiet hum of a partnership that survived the freeze. If this story resonated with the unexpected turns your own heart has taken, subscribe for more. Tell me in the comments, what risk are you waiting to take?